Hello, and thank you for joining me for what I believe is my third or fourth webinar of this lockdown period, delivered from my bunker in Haggerston, North London. I hope you and your families, and importantly your clients, have kept well and safe during this unprecedented global pandemic. Among many things, I think COVID-19 has provided a timely and brutal reminder of both the uncertainty of life in general, and in our much more limited world, the fact that stock markets can swing violently, particularly over the short term. And I think wrapped within both things, it emphasises the value of getting good quality independent financial advice. And I think the role of financial advisors and the value that financial advisors can provide has never been clearer than it has been in the past 3 to 4 months or so. So as the country slowly emerges from lockdown, focus is inevitably going to turn to what happens next, both for individuals and for wider government policy too. And that's what I'm going to focus on today in these few slides in this short presentation, specifically looking at what the fallout from COVID-19 might mean for pensions policy. So quick summary of what we're going to look at here. So we'll kick off by outlining where we are at the moment, both in terms of a societal impact of COVID-19 and how the nation's finances are looking. We'll draw on some various pieces of research that AJ Bell has conducted throughout the pandemic with consumers to track both how they're responding and what their views are on various different possible policy interventions. We'll then look at how the government has reacted to COVID-19 from a personal finance perspective. So one policy which it has tweaked in order to help people, the lifetime ISA, and one that so far it hasn't, the money purchase annual allowance. We'll then move from those personal finance policies to things that may potentially happen in the future, so some longer term implications, specifically around the state pension triple lock. And I almost feel the need to apologise for this, but a slide on pensions tax relief as well, which is inevitably going to become part of the debate once again, and will be something that clients will, I suspect, be hearing about over the next few months as we move towards another budget. We'll then look again at a little bit more research that we've done in terms of what the public thinks about different possible tax raising options, before a quick note on investment pathways and then some conclusions, and then we will be done. Just to note, if you have any questions, if you want to ask me anything or you want to ask AJ Bell anything, then you can pop those down in the control panel on the right, or you can email either the marketing team, or feel free to email me directly. My email address is tom.selby@ajbell.co.uk. There'll be a reminder of those at the end of the presentation as well. So as we've been in lockdown for the best part of 4 months now, and it feels every day of those 4 months, frankly, it's easy to become slightly numb to the scale of what has happened and the challenges that it poses for the UK government and specifically the Treasury. We may or may not be through the worst of the virus from a health perspective, and there are certainly, we're seeing as I speak, stories of outbreaks in localized outbreaks in Germany and in parts of the US and China as well. But in terms of the UK economy, the teeth of this crisis is very much yet to come. So just in terms of the numbers, You can see on this slide that the size and the scale of the direct support schemes launched by the government. So, of course, the furloughing scheme, coronavirus job retention scheme. I should say that these numbers are correct as of speaking, and as of writing, they may be updated once this webinar goes out. But somewhere in the region of 8 million people being paid directly by the state at a cost of 11.1 billion. The self-employed also being supported via the self-employment income support scheme to the tune of just over 6 billion. Over 21 billion pounds lent to more than 500,000 businesses via various different government-backed loans, all in government decisions during COVID-19, estimated to have cost an eye-watering 132.5 billion in extra public sector borrowing during 2020 and 21. Beyond that, of course, we need to layer on the macroeconomic impact of shutting the economy down for coming on for 4 months now. So a couple of key numbers there. Gross domestic product down 32% in Q2. I mean, and again, I started this slide by saying that we become numb to these figures, and I can feel as I'm talking through them, the appreciating just the scale of what we're talking about here is quite hard to wrap, certainly for me, to wrap my head around. So GDP down 32% in the second quarter of the year versus Q1, unemployment up 10% in a quarter. Unprecedented figures, certainly in my lifetime. The net result and the big challenge facing the government as we hopefully start to edge out of lockdown and back to something that looks a little more like normality is how to deal with what's expected to be a near £300 billion hole in the public finances, and that inevitably is going to lead to questions about certain pensions policies. But before we get onto those, the impact that COVID-19 and the lockdown and the economic effect may have on pensions policies, I just wanted to quickly run you through some of the key findings from various pieces of consumer research AJ Bell has carried out over the last few months. So that's what we'll cover off in the next 3 slides. And as an overarching theme, financial resilience has long been a serious problem in the UK. People are often woefully underprepared or indeed entirely unprepared for even minor changes in their cost of living. The idea of a boiler breaking down would bring lots and lots of people out in a cold sweat, never mind the prospect of losing their main source of income or having to take a severe pay cut. So clearly COVID-19 has placed huge pressures on incomes in a variety of ways, and there is reasonable evidence to suggest that people simply aren't prepared for this. So based on our research with Opinion, over 15 million people had dipped into savings that they had during the early stages of COVID-19. But because lots of people didn't have savings to dip into, 11 million people have taken on extra debt, be that through credit cards, overdrafts, or loans being the most, loans from loved one being the most common cited during our research. Clearly that's a society that's already indebted, potentially loading on extra personal finance debt in order to get through this crisis. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given that they've had less time to build up wealth and build up savings, it's younger people who have been hardest hit certainly during those early phases of lockdown. So 44% of those in the 18 to 34 bracket, so loosely millennials often deemed, have had to deplete their savings, compared to just 18% of those over the age of 55. So yeah, I kicked off this little batch of slides talking about financial resilience, and we can see that borne out here. So 1 in 5 UK workers had no emergency cash whatsoever prior to us entering this period of lockdown. Slightly worryingly, women are much more likely to have no emergency cash than men, and I suspect that that's a factor of the differences in salaries that women still experience in today's workplace. Of those who did have a cash buffer in place, the most common amount was around 3 months' salary, although we saw quite a lot of variation here. So anything from obviously many people having no cash at all to some people saying they had over 24 months of salary held in cash for an emergency. And once again, unsurprisingly, younger people tended to say they had less cash held in reserve than their older counterparts. The final thing that we asked people around was pension scams and the extent to which they would respond positively or negatively to some of the more common scam tactics. Now, this is a subject that's particularly close to my heart. It's something I've campaigned on extensively since joining AJ Bell about 4.5 years ago now. And while lots of excellent work has been done, I believe, on scams, both to raise awareness and to stop some of the common tactics used, specifically around the ban on pensions, cold calling, I think the figures on this slide just show that there's a huge amount of work still left to do. So 1 in 8 people under the age of 55 would consider an offer to access their pension early, particularly worrying given that we're in a period where, as I mentioned, financial resilience already low, lots of people facing income and job insecurity. That's the kind of environment where scammers will tend to thrive, and one of the kind of scams that we expect to see potentially rearing its ugly head once again will be scams which aim to allow people to access their pension early. Of course, these scams are often entirely fraudulent, even when they're not. The people who are on the end of them will end up being taxed heavily and may end up getting back nothing at all. In terms of those more likely to fall for these kinds of scams, so younger savers more at risk, 21% of 18 to 34-year-olds said they'd consider an early access offer. Very important, that's in inverted commas there, offer, not the kind of offer you want to be accepting, of course. 13% versus 13% of 35 to 54-year-olds. So perhaps the hubris of youth being born out there in those survey results. And men under 55, twice as likely to consider an early access pension offer as women. Again, worryingly, in relation to the ban on cold calling, so I think that's been a very effective measure in some ways, but still almost 1 in 10 would consider accepting a call from someone they don't know about their retirement pot, and another 8% said they may or may not. Younger people, again, particularly susceptible to this tactic. So some good work done on pension scams, but the uncertainty created by COVID-19 is the kind of environment where scammers will thrive. And I think it's a timely reminder that everyone in the industry, from providers to regulators to advisors, and everyone in between, needs to redouble their efforts in communicating the dangers of these schemes so that more people can be protected from them. So that's covered a little bit of the macro effects and some of our consumer research. I now just wanted to touch on one area where the government has taken action in relation to COVID in order to help younger savers with lifetime ISAs. So just a quick reminder, lifetime ISAs launched 2-3 years ago, aimed squarely at savers in the younger age bracket, so age 18 to 39, who are saving for either their first home or for retirement. So you can save £4,000 annually in a lifetime ISA, and that will be topped up by a 25% bonus, so a maximum of £1,000. You can keep contributing until 50 and keep receiving the bonus until age 50. Withdrawals then tax-free, either for a deposit on your first home if it's worth 450 grand or less when you reach age 60, or if you fall into terminal ill health. One of the big problems with the lifetime ISA, and one of the difficulties in explaining the lifetime ISA, has come around the existence of the early withdrawal charge, the government imposed early withdrawal charge, which at 25%, of course, acts as effectively a penalty on the money that people look to take out in non-qualifying circumstances. If you run through the maths there, that's a penalty of around 6.25%. assuming no investment growth or investment drops. Now, the government faced some significant pressure before COVID-19 hit to look again at this, to simplify the product and, frankly, to remove a feature of the product which the Financial Conduct Authority has deemed unacceptable for the retail market. It seems odd that the government feels it's acceptable for a product that it has launched. We had some positive movement on that at the beginning of May, so the government listened to arguments from the industry, from AJ Bell and from others, that the exit penalty, which was always, we felt, unfair, looks particularly unfair at a time when people were facing strains on their finances and would potentially be more likely to access their lifetime ISA in a non-qualifying situation and thus be hit by the exit penalty if they were struggling to make ends meet during this period of crisis. So the easement that the government has announced is a temporary one, so early withdrawals from the 6th of March this year until 5th of April 2021 will be hit with a 20% early withdrawal charge rather than a 25% withdrawal charge. So that just means that the aim of the withdrawal charge is to return the government bonus and nothing more, rather than the previous withdrawal charge, which returns the government bonus and then adds an extra exit penalty on top. Now, you probably noticed that this change has been applied retrospectively. So the change announced on the 1st of May that applied to withdrawals made from 6th of March. HMRC has since confirmed those who've accessed the lifetime ISA and paid a 25% penalty already can be refunded the difference either directly into their lifetime ISA account or from their provider. Unfortunately, while this is a positive move, the Treasury says that the exit penalty will return to 25% from the next tax year, although we'll have to see whether they go ahead with that or not. We would hope that they would make the reduction in the exit penalty and the exit charge permanent. So the government, in one area aimed at younger people, has accepted that the existence of a barrier to people accessing their own money is unfair and inappropriate during a period of extreme stress for people financially. But when it comes to over 55s, it's been more difficult to get any movement from the government, and so far we haven't managed to get the government to rethink the way the money purchase annual allowance works. So again, looking at another piece of consumer research we carried out, 1 in 10 over 55s with a pension have either already accessed or plan to access their retirement pot earlier than anticipated, directly as a result of COVID-19. Now, not all of these withdrawals will lead to the money purchase annual allowance kicking in, but some of them will, and it seems to me and it seems to us that if the logic carries the lifetime ISA exit penalty should be reduced, then surely the money purchase annual allowance needs to be looked at in light of the difficulties people are already facing as a result of COVID-19 and the difficulties that are likely to continue as the furlough scheme is reduced and people face increasing financial pain. So just a reminder of how things work at the moment. So those who flexibly access taxable income for their pension for the first time during this crisis, or indeed at any time, first of all, will be taxed on emergency month one basis. Another bugbear of mine, and something we've pushed the Treasury, HMRC relentlessly on to try to address. So that means that a month one basis means that they'll receive 1/12 of their usual tax allowances, and as a result will be overtaxed on their first withdrawal of the tax year and will need to claim that money back. And then, of course, they will trigger the money purchase annual allowance, which acts as a huge penalty on their ability to save in the future. So annual allowance reduced from £40,000 to £4,000. Not only that, but the ability to carry forward annual allowances from up to the 3 previous tax years is also lost. Now, so far, as I mentioned at the start, the Treasury reluctant to do anything on the MPAA, although we'll continue to make the case. In the meantime, there are ways to access money from your pension from age 55 without triggering such a significant reduction in your annual allowance. So of course, only accessing the 25% tax-free lump sum and leaving the rest of your money untouched is one simple way. The other is to utilise the small pots rules. So where you have three, you can take up to three £10,000 withdrawals from non-occupational defined contribution funds and unlimited £10,000 withdrawals from occupational defined contribution funds. According to those rules, you need to extinguish those funds in their entirety in order for it not to trigger the money purchase annual allowance. And if you do that within the compounds of those rules, then 25% of the money will be tax-free. The rest will be taxed in the same way as income, but the MPAA will not be triggered. So some ways around this this problem for clients, but in many cases the barrier will unfortunately remain. So turning now away from one policy that the government has done something on and one policy that the government has yet to do something on, to something that it seems the government will have to move on, and that is the state pension triple lock. So as a reminder, the state pension triple lock, introduced back in 2010 by then Pensions Minister Steve Webb, guarantees annual increases in the state pension in line with the highest of average earnings, the Consumer Prices Index, or 2.5%. Now, there have been arguments about the state pension triple lock for a while, arguments around fairness, and also generally arguments around whether ratcheting up the value of the state pension at random based on the underlying economic circumstances of the time is really a sensible way of increasing the value of the state pension. It's effectively, say, it's an admittance that the state pension is too low without any direction as to how high it needs to get or when it needs to get there. So it was a problem before this crisis hit. However, in a world where average earnings are set to plummet in 1 year and then rise dramatically the following year, the triple lock starts to look increasingly unsustainable. So a reminder that the triple lock doesn't apply to all elements of the state pension, so it just applies to the flat rate amount, so that's set at £175.20 a week for this tax year, and to the old pre-2016 basic amount. But if you consider the OBR's estimates for what's going to happen to the economy over the next 2 years, and clearly estimates needed to be treated with a fairly significant pinch of salt, even when they're coming from the OBR. They're expecting a fall in average earnings of 7.3% in 2020 before a rise in average earnings of 18.3% in 2021. However, because of the triple lock, if the triple lock remains in place, the flat rate state pension, and we'll focus on that now just for simplicity, would increase 21.3% in value over the next 2 years based on the OBR's economic modelling. So the 2.5% lock would kick in this in 2021, and then the 18.3% earnings link, if that transpired, would kick in 2022, increasing the value of this flat rate state pension from £175.20 to just over £212. If you compare that to just an average earnings link, the government would be looking at increasing the value of the state pension by somewhere in the region of 10% over the course of those 2 years, so less than half the value that you would see increase as a result of the triple lock. If it was increasing by inflation only, then the state pension would increase in value by just 3.5%. So you have issues here around fairness. So if the working population is experiencing significant falls in average earnings, then there's questions of why those who are in receipt of the state pension should continue to be protected. And there's also going to be a significant issue of cost here. There's absolutely no chance in hell that the Treasury had factored in the possibility that over a 2-year period, the triple lock would mean the state pension rising in value by over 20%. That's just not the case. If you look at it's quite hard to get an exact figure on the impact this might have on the public finances, but if you look in 2018-19, the total amount spent on state pension was just shy of 100 billion. We'll be probably just over 100 billion now, given our ageing population. Now, not all of that will increase in line with the triple lock, but a significant chunk of it will do, and so you don't have to be too extreme in terms of the growth forecast to imagine that the state pension triple lock may cost somewhere in the region of 10 billion or more than the government had been expecting, given the 300 billion hole they already face in the public finances as a result of COVID-19. It's highly possible that we'll need to see some change to the triple lock, whether that's a temporary change or a permanent change. We will have to wait and see, but the economics of it look particularly difficult if the scenario that the OBR has set out there plays out in reality. Now, I said at the start that I would apologise before talking about pension tax relief, and that is exactly what I will do. Unfortunately, given the fiscal situation, I'd suggest it's a racing certainty that tax relief will be back in the headlines in the coming weeks and months. The government has made manifesto commitments not to increase income tax rates, national insurance rates or VAT, as well as, of course, to keep the state pension triple lock. And while I don't think many people will be holding the Conservative Party to their manifesto, given how much the world has changed since that document was written, I suspect that the government will want to do all it can to stick as closely as it possibly can to the promises it made to the electorate only 6 months or so ago. If you think about the way you would expect a traditional Conservative government to respond to a period of crisis, it would be through tax cutting, be that cuts in NI rates, cuts in VAT, which we've already seen some stories suggesting that may happen, or cuts in income tax rates. But nonetheless, you would expect there to be some pressure for them to raise money in the short term via the tax system as well. And when you look at that overall environment, all of a sudden pension tax relief does look particularly vulnerable. So the cost of pension tax relief back in 2017-18, and we always have slightly outdated figures here because HMRC takes a while to get through the full tax returns, but you're looking at the annual cost of tax relief being about £40 billion. I've got the actual cost, so the difference between the amount that's paid on pension withdrawals and the amount that's given, the amount of tax paid on pension withdrawals and the amount that is given in tax relief at the front end is around £20 billion. So around half that, but still a significant cost to the Treasury. We know that the Treasury's already done a large amount of work on reform proposals in this area, including the idea of shifting to a pension ISA structure, as well as the possibility of creating a flat rate of pension tax relief, although, of course, those ideas were shelved, in part, we believe, because of the inherent complexity of dealing with defined benefit pension schemes in a flat rate pension tax relief world. As we move out of this crisis and pressure inevitably falls on pension tax relief, we'll be trying with any influence that we can possibly muster to get the government to see the big picture and to think long term on retirement savings incentives. So at the moment we have a hideously complicated pensions tax system. We have 3 different types of annual allowances. We have a lifetime allowance, we have different forms of protection, all of which not all of which of course will affect every single saver, but all of which need to be communicated to people so that they understand what their annual allowance or their lifetime allowance may or may not be at any given point in time. And it's our view that rather than looking to uproot pensions tax relief for what is to address what is a short-term problem, the focus of government policy here needs to remain long-term, needs to remain on keeping things as simple as possible and encouraging more people to save for their financial futures. And it goes back to the point I made at the start about financial resilience. One of the biggest problems this country faces and faced as we went into lockdown was a lack of financial resilience among the general population. People tend to not save either for the short term or the long term, and any move to undermine some of the early positive work that's going on through automatic enrolment by taking the axe to pension tax relief to deal with COVID-19 could have severe longer term unintended consequences. So last couple of slides now. We've touched on a few areas of public policy and a few things that the government could or couldn't do in order to pay off some of the bill relating to COVID-19. Of course, the direction that the government moves in will be driven, at least in part, by the cold hard facts of electoral politics. Namely, will the reforms that I want to do or taxes I want to raise be accepted by the general public? So with that in mind, we again, alongside opinion, canvassed views of the great British public to see what they would or wouldn't be willing to accept. I'll very briefly talk through this slide, but we were quite surprised actually at just how willing people said they were to pay extra income tax in order to fund the COVID-19 response. I suspect this perhaps comes from the fact that there's been a sense that in lockdown we've all been in this together, and perhaps as we look to move out of lockdown, people accept that there's a need to pay a bit more income tax in order to foot what is a fairly obvious bill that everybody can see. So on average, UK employees said they'd be accepted to pay almost 4% extra in income tax, with almost a fifth willing to pay an extra 5% in income tax. Now, clearly responding to a survey about income tax and actually paying it are two very different things, but it just gives you an idea that people are potentially open to tax rises in a way that they may not have been previously. If we move on to the second bullet point there, that just makes that point even clearer. So 2/3 agree we all have a responsibility to contribute. The majority say the government was right to increase borrowing during the crisis. And most people say that tax rises are a necessary evil to deal with the situation arising from COVID-19. Now, quite interestingly, when we looked at the kinds of things, the kinds of tax increases that people might be willing to accept, right at the top of the list were dividends and capital gains tax cuts. I suspect in reality that's because most people responding to the survey would have felt that those measures wouldn't affect them directly, so would have been deemed more acceptable. But the third down on that list was income tax cuts. So I think many people are genuinely willing to countenance the possibility of paying a little bit more tax over a period of time in order to pay off the COVID-19 bill. But interestingly, pension cuts were the least popular of the options listed among respondents, removing the state pension triple lock at 10%, and right at the bottom of the pile, restricting pension tax relief at 9% were the two least favoured options. So if the government thinks attacking pensions tax relief is going to be a simple or stealthy or uncontroversial option in order to address the massive borrowing hole that's been created by COVID-19, then it may need to just look at the views of voters and consider what that might mean for their popularity as we move out of this crisis. A quick sideways move on this side to Financial Conduct Authority measure, namely investment pathways. So these are reforms that are being introduced with the aim of providing an okay outcome for non-advised drawdown customers. So the FCA confirmed in April that the rules around investment pathways are being delayed. So they were due to be coming into play in August this year, given the amount of work facing both the industry and the regulator. That's been pushed back to February 2021. Just a reminder, under the Pathways proposals, providers will be required to nudge customers towards investment solutions tailored to 4 broad retirement outcomes. So you can see those listed there, options 1 to 4. So moving from having no plans to touch your money at all in the next 5 years, right down to planning to take all of your money out within the next 5 years. So different, so pathways offered for each of those different responses. With the regulators, one of the central reasons set out by the FCA in terms of the need for pathways being worries that it had over the fact that some people were holding large chunks of cash in their pensions in drawdown. This isn't just a non-advised issue, though. This is kind of takes us a little bit back to the old RU64 stakeholder pensions days. So advisors will be required to consider pathways options when making recommendations to clients as part of the new suitability rules that come in alongside investment pathways. So they'll have to consider pathways investments when making drawdown recommendations, be that cap drawdown recommendations or flexi access drawdown recommendations. So it goes much wider than the simple non-advised customer intervention. But if we look more broadly at what's happened between March and April, May, we saw for the first time really since the great financial crisis of 2007-2008 a significant downturn in financial markets. Now, if investment pathways had been in place before that had happened, and lots of customers who perhaps were holding a reasonable amount of money in cash were nudged towards investments that aren't cash. And remember that plenty of bond investments suffered double-digit falls in those early days of the COVID-19 outbreak as well. So there were very few safe havens away from cash in those early days. Can you imagine the queue of people complaining at the door of the industry would be? It would potentially have been a significant scandal. And as with the FCA now pushing back the deadline for implementing investment pathways, we hope there's a period of time here for the regulator and for the wider industry to just calmly reflect on the appropriateness of those proposals and the extent to which drawdown is the right time to be nudging people into certain pathways. Personally, I believe that trying to create a safe pathway for people in drawdown and a pathway where no engagement is required simply doesn't work. This is a part of the retirement market where people need to be engaged, people need to be making decisions, ideally with the help of their financial advisor. And the idea that you can somehow build something which nudges people in a direction that's appropriate and won't risk having huge complaints when things go wrong simply doesn't work. So we hope the FCA will have time to revisit those proposals, and we will once again be making our case to them in the coming weeks and months. So just a few conclusions from me to wrap this up. So COVID-19 clearly having a huge impact on wider society, but also on the UK economy, a £300 billion hole in UK finances, and of course, millions of job losses likely to come as well. Financial resilience, a key theme both going into this crisis and I suspect coming out of this crisis as well. So lots of people either having to take on debt or deplete their limited savings in order to get them through this crisis. And the next stage will be getting people hopefully back into work as hopefully the economy starts to pick up again. And then once people are in work and have the ability to save, encourage them to put more aside, not just in pensions, but in ISAs and in good cash products as well, in order to ensure that more of the population are prepared for this type of event, which tends to come around every 10 to 15 years. In terms of the wider political outlook, very unlikely the Conservative manifesto will hold in my view, although it's still worth having an eye on the direction that manifesto would look to go in, because you would suspect that the government will want to stick as closely to it as it humanly can, while also pivoting in order to pay off some of the costs associated with this crisis. The state pension triple lock looks particularly vulnerable given the significant drop in earnings we're likely to see this year, and then the potential rebound next year. If you're looking at a bill of somewhere in excess of £10 billion for that, that's probably a bit too pricey, and it's not exactly fair either. So one option could be simply to place a temporary cap on the triple lock for 2022-23, when the significant cost is likely to come through to the Treasury. Not a huge amount to say on pension tax relief, other than watch out for the headlines and expect to get some questions from clients about it. But in reality, whether or not the government will finally make a move on pension tax relief is to be seen, and we hope they'll take a longer term view on things. And as a final point, I think for the industry, for providers, for regulators, and for everyone involved in helping clients, the stock market downturn that we saw in March and April raises questions about the role of cash in investment portfolios, and to my mind, the appropriateness in particular of investment pathways reforms, which try to nudge people away from the safe haven that is cash and towards stock markets, which are inherently risky, particularly over the short term. I think we need to move to a more balanced debate where the risks of holding too much cash are understood, namely the impact of inflation on the value of that money, but also the risks of investing are balanced against that properly as well. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. As I mentioned at the start, if you have any questions, then you can stick them in the bar on the right hand side if you haven't already done that. If you'd rather email me or the marketing team directly, you can do. My email address is tom.selby@ajbell.co.uk. All I have to say is stay safe. I hope you're all managing to get outside a bit more now that lockdown is easing. I believe when this goes out to air, we'll be a mere 2 days away from going to pubs, albeit in a socially distanced environment. So I hope you and your families and your clients can enjoy that, and I'll hopefully speak to you again soon. Thanks.